So I've been doing the TypeScript type challenges, and they're inherently puzzly and heady and not necessarily directly useful. Like there's some really intense ones that involve doing lots of math and like recursion busting. What has come up a lot is some of the even some of the co-hosts, as always a co-host with me, have like a very intense gut reaction, like a negative reaction to what they see. And what I've noticed is that people who are library authors who have been doing TypeScript like at the like library author level don't have that reaction. And it's kind of shown me that there's a bit of a divide. I don't know if all languages have this, but or all communities, forget about language, even like libraries. But I don't know if they're like Django developers that are like at a whole other level than the rest of the, or like WordPress developers that are a whole other level. But I'm curious if you have any perspective on the things that library authors need, like infer and the conditional types and key remapping and distributed unions. These are things that library authors are like have on the back of their hand, but most average TypeScript developers can go decades probably of using TypeScript on a daily basis and doing beautiful stuff without ever having to touch any of that stuff. Have you seen something like this in your day-to-day, that there's people that come at it from very, very different perspectives with completely different needs? And I'm just curious how you as a team cater to both of those groups, because like if you go look at the code of Zod, you'll see things that you would never ever see in a regular code base, but Zod really needs it.
Yeah.
And people really need Zod. So, by the, transitive property, they must really need it, but only indirectly.
Well, the way you can kind of think about it is a library is trying to provide something that the base language doesn't exactly give you. And so you try to build something almost like a DSL or something like a domain-specific language that, or some sort of basic function that does something maybe a little cute, but gives you something that is very rich in the output, right? And so like if you think about something like any UI library right there, like React or Angular or Svelte or whatever, Vue, like they all do something that is very metaprogrammy under the hood, right? Like Vue is creating computed properties and reactive properties and things like that, especially in the original API. And they're iterating over things, and they're doing things that are not just like, I go over a list and I do some stuff and I map all of those properties, right? Like they're trying to create something that you can basically say like, oh, I can now just do blah, right? And so that metaprogramming stuff is kind of like a natural thing that you would do in JavaScript if you already understand JavaScript, right? But like, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of like what people were going to do in JavaScript anyway, right? That you're going to create a getter and a setter on the fly. And so like most people in their day-to-day JavaScript probably don't want to have to do that sort of thing as well. But if you can kind of create this reusable thing, it feels nice. And so like, I think it was like around TypeScript 2.1, right? Like after we had all the control flow, we had undefined, all that. We had string literals and numeric literals and things like that.
Yep.
And then there was this point where we were looking at like, I was talking to the Ember people and I was talking to like the Vue people, and I was thinking like, okay, well, there's this clear need for like, how do you express that? I need to get a property or set a property or I need to say it's one of these properties or something like that.
Yep.
And so that's what kind of led us to all move onto key of, and then index access, and then map type. Those all came in, I think, the same release, which is nuts. Mapped object types. And so that's like the first time where we really started to say, I think, oh, we actually have ways in the type system to model that metaprogramming that's actually happening. Conceptually, you're just describing a get and a set for a lot of these things. You're just describing how you would create a new object on the fly. But most of your day-to-day programming is not creating a new object on the fly. That's like a thing that a lot of libraries and frameworks will do just to make your life easier. So there is that divide. We do try to, we hope that often library authors can keep things sort of simple, because that abstraction still leaks out to the user is a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can say, oh, it's just for library authors, but then like a user gets a type error, and now it's like 15 levels of conditional types, and so like
Yeah.
there's a balance between like I can do this and maybe I should do this and stuff like that. But we don't always have the right answer for that either. So
yeah, I think if you think about a conditional type is an if, right?
Yeah.
If you go read the docs for a place where someone used a conditional type, you'll see an if in the documentation where someone says, if given a string, returns a number. If given an array, returns a string. If given a Boolean, returns a function. That if given whatever, right? And that's where I think things get a little hairy for users, because ultimately TypeScript is talking to users in its error messages and tooltips in those same sorts of like large primitives that the library authors are putting. I think when you say library authors, my head went to a bunch of different places, and I was thinking like, well, it's definitely true for some kind of libraries. I was thinking like, the DTS file for leftpad is like pretty straightforward.
Sure.
I think it'd be interesting as an exercise to go through and say like, okay, for all the packages on definitely typed, like what is their true minimum TypeScript version? And like look at a histogram of that, because if you got something that's like, this is a zip and unzip library, right? Like I'm pretty sure like TypeScript 1.8 could handle it. And then if you look at something like, React or this library, I'm sure it's like 5.0 nightly, 5.1 nightly.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, yeah, it's something that is, it's just interesting because for me, I find it interesting because I'm trying to provide content for those very small subset of people who need to know about what distributive unions are and how they work. And there's just so very little interest in that at the wider spectrum. I mean, some people are interested just out of curiosity, but almost nobody really needs these skills. But the ones who need it really need it.
The hope for a lot of the things that we built was like distributivity is the really frustrating one, because we talked a lot about this around map types. That was the first one where like actually no, conditional types had this like much more front and center, right? Is that whenever you have a specific kind of conditional type, then we distribute over any union input type that's on the left side.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a question of like, should we have a thing that says like, I want to distribute over each of these things, because that like basing it off of that heuristic is like kind of weird. And we ended up not doing that because it felt so strange that by default, you would always forget to do the distribute over thing. And so library authors would have had to say like, oh man, it's so annoying when I have to, like, I forget this thing, and in all my tests, I just use like one type, and then as soon as I get a union, I forget to do that thing, and my users say like, now I have an array of the union instead of like an array of foo or an array of bar, or whatever.
Yeah, I actually chip in every now and then to maintain the React types over the last few years, and what you just said is something that definitely comes up, that someone will say, hey, why is there a conditional here? It just says T extends T.
Yeah.
Or like T extends any. Why does that? And they'll like put in a couple months ago, someone put in a PR to remove that. And I had to be like, no. Please leave it there. And I worry sometimes that those things will pass review. I'll show you guys a funny one. This is a screenshot from a Andrew Burgess. This is like my favorite thing the TypeScript compiler has ever given me. But this is the kind of like computed type from a challenge that we were doing for deep object to unique. It was called, I guess.
Why do you keep pulling up examples that make us feel bad?
No. It's not to make you feel bad. It's that like when you start doing crazy things, it's like, or just like very intense things that maybe don't have the most application, but just for the sake of learning. These are all learning exercises mostly anyway. So there's a lot of things like people ask, like one of them is the Fibonacci sequence. So the people ask like, why would you need to do the Fibonacci sequence in your type system? And it's like, you don't. It's just for learning.
Right.
But
for science.
Yeah, exactly, for science.